So welcome to the first in a series of little fireside conversations, perhaps that's what we should call them, hosted by Solent University and MeCCSA Practice Network. They very much build on conversations that we had at this year's MeCCSA conference about creative practice research. And I think that the key here is that while creative practice research is definitely accepted and recognised by the Academy, there's still lots of questions about it, especially for people new to the idea. And so this series of webinars is really just trying to unpack some of those questions for myself primarily, because I'm still trying to understand and get my head around a lot of this stuff. It can be quite theoretically dense. But also I want to share that with other people, because these are obviously conversations that have value to people. If people are interested, the creativemediapractice.com seminars website, go and have a look. We will be uploading there's another free that I've got booked for next year, which will be added to that site shortly. If you want to keep updated, thing to do is just to add yourself to the email list. I think there's an email list. If there isn't, I'll set one up. The meeting is being recorded and will be edited later and put up on the MeCCSA Practice Network YouTube channel to offer some legacy for everything. So welcome to everyone. Welcome to Joanne Scott, who's our opening session on bridging the gap. And I think that's very much the tone of the conversation today, is this idea of bridging the gap between creative practice and research. Joanne is a pioneering researcher and practitioner in the field of intermedial performance and creative practice research. Her acclaimed monograph, Intermedial Praxis and Practice as Research, Doing Thinking in Practice, explores innovative methods for integrating live performance with digital media, offering vital insights to the intersection of theory and practice and academic research. And if you are able to get a copy of the book, I do recommend it. And I'd also like to note that you really need to read it hand in hand with the website, and the website commentaries are really, really insightful, and actually they unpack the methodology and the approach and the ideas underpinning the way that the book or the thesis in the book is kind of presented. So I do recommend it. If it's not in your department library, get it in there. I've just had really enjoyed reading it, actually. So, but it's not about me. Joanne, would you like to introduce yourself? How would you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Roy. And thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation to come and speak and to have a conversation, which I think is a really fresh and lovely way of doing this. I've done quite a lot of seminars where it's, much more formal presentation followed by questions. And I'm really engaged by the idea of discourse and conversation. And also thank you to Solent Uni and MeCCSA as well for supporting this. Okay, so I introduce myself these days as an artist researcher, but it's taken me a while to get to that stage. And what's interesting about that for me when I think about it is that I always used to talk about myself as a practitioner researcher, because somehow I was avoiding the word artist. That had some weight and some connotation that I wasn't really willing or ready to take on. And that reflects the fact that for me, bridging the gap was from research into creative practice rather than the other way around, which I think we will discuss. So it's taken me a while to think of what I do in those terms and to call myself an artist. And even so, I would always attach that artist to a researcher, simply because there's nothing that I make that isn't an inquiring kind of practice. It isn't something that's trying to find something out. So I'm an artist researcher. I'm based in central Portugal. I have creative practice that really spans a number of different forms of media. So performance, installation, sound art, audiovisual pieces, and more recently, lots of work in sound walks in particular. So at the heart of all of that work, I think, is really an interest in fleeting felt states and how they might be traced through digital mixing practices. And usually those mixing practices are characterized by being broadly improvised and created on the fly. I'm really interested in how materials meet each other in the context of a live mix and what emerges there as a kind of a new feeling or a new state. With my doctoral research was very much focused on investigating form, the form of that particular kind of intermedial performance that I was developing. But after that, and postdoctoral research has really been then using these different kinds of creative digital practices to explore and investigate different ideas and topics. So I'm very engaged with exploring place, different types of places. I've looked at surveillance technology, wild nature in cities. And my most recent focus is on what I'm referring to as changing, disturbed and damaged landscapes, obviously in light of climate change, habitat and biodiversity loss. And my current artistic research project is using creative fieldwork, which is something that I'm developing as a set of practices. I'm using this creative fieldwork to explore forest plantations here in central Portugal. And I'll leave that there. That's the summary that I'd like to offer. That's the introduction I'd like to make, but I'll put my website in the chat in case anybody wants to follow up on that.
So I already want to talk to you about forest plantations because I'm engaged in a similar project at the moment, and but that's for another conversation.
Yeah, wow, that sounds good.
Do you want to have a go unpacking this idea of creative practice research as doing thinking as practice?
Yeah, so I think what I'll, in terms of this question, I always tend to start with the notion of praxis, so that praxis word, which was the first thing that I ever saw, heard and understood that linked me to this area of this idea that you could engage in creative practice and it would be a research endeavour and a research inquiry. And I heard it first when I was doing my MA at Central School of Speech and Drama in London. And Robin Nelson was a visiting professor. He was giving a lecture and he talked about praxis. And he used this term that he uses in a lot of his books, which is this idea that praxis is theory imbricated with practice. And imbrication is something to do with things being kind of sticky and stuck together and infused and really closely engaged. So we might think about practices infused with ideas, or indeed ideas informed by and interrogated through practices, that this bi-directional relationship between the doing of something and the thinking of something. But I also think it refers to the idea of practices being a mode of thinking in and of themselves, where art making can be exploring, can be unpacking, can be investigating, can be finding out. So I think as a kind of slight sidebar, it really does relate to the ideas of embodied ways of knowing and embodied cognition. So this set of understandings that we understand and perceive the world through our bodies sensorially, that we learn through material interactions and doings, and that really our thinking happens through those kinds of doings. So I recently looked at Anil Seth's book, which is called Being You, about consciousness. And he claims really that when you are being yourself, essentially, that is a deeply embodied process. Being you is literally about your body, and therefore embodied cognition is about knowing in and through that body. We might also think of extended cognition through theorists like Andy Clark, where that is the way in which you think through your tools and the things that surround you. So maybe any of the different tools you engage with as a creative practitioner could be part of the way in which you think, and also the way in which your doing thinking happens. And I think that kind of broad understanding of the way in which we engage with the world informs the notion of doing thinking. So our ways of researching are not just thinking about things, where we think about thinking as disembodied sets of processes over here or within this kind of headspace, but that we are thinking through sets of actions and activities. And I think in terms of creative practice research, the important thing about this is that we, the researchers, privilege the doing of art making as the site of knowledge making. So that is where the research happens. That's where the knowing comes about. That's where we find out, where we explore, where we learn, and where we understand our types of creative doing as something that can be theory generating, contributing to the sum of knowledge and ideas in the world. And I can talk about that a little bit more later if that's helpful. Often we might think about this kind of knowing that happens within doing thinking as tacit, as something that's quite embedded within us and sometimes can be implicit, quite difficult to express to others, quite difficult to make explicit to somebody who might want to understand it. But that's part, I think, of the challenge of creative practice research, is making some of those things which are quite innate, embedded, tacit to your practice and to you as a practitioner, explicit to somebody who does not do that, but would like to know more about what that is and therefore contribute to our understanding of your making and what that offers to the world. The other thing that I would say is that doing thinking is activated through modes of reflection, but maybe we can move on to those.
Well, yes, I think we definitely need to move on to that at some point. When you were just talking about defining imbrication, I was sort actually maybe entangled is a word we could kind of use there, and the value of entangled kind of sets up the difficulty of disentangling. And it almost feels like part of what we're being asked to do is to disentangle, having done the thinking and doing, we're then being asked to disentangle it all and turn it into something that it's not, which is the written text. So actually, I think that's a really good point to say. Do you want to talk a little bit about that process of reflection and production of a text, which is not the work?
Yeah, there is definitely a role, I think, for written text. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I have some issues with the ways in which practitioner researchers are asked to formulate their ideas, often in very kinds of formal academic ways, which, as you say, do not reflect effectively necessarily what the practice is doing. Sometimes that formality is required for various different reasons. But I always think that within the context of what is being required of you through a qualification or a particular institutional requirement that you might have, there is room for you to be able to play with that in relation to what absolutely, and this is the thing I always say to people in relation to how you talk about and think about and articulate your work, you have to honor the practice because the practice is the site of the knowledge making. So if you think about the practice as being central to what people need to understand, but you might need to unpick and untangle what is going on in there because they weren't there when it happened or they haven't been through the process that you have been through, then there are different types of writing and text that can give us access to that. And there's different types of documentation that can help somebody understand what it is that you think is significant about what that practice is doing, what it has found out and how it has found out. So I think the idea of the monolithic academic text that is singular in relation to the creative practice, I would question. And I would say there's room for lots of different types of modes of writing and communication in relation to practice, which can reveal its insights and can reveal its processes. Having said that, I think that there is no kind of way round reflection in creative practice research. It is intrinsic and you have to do it. It's part of the process. And I would always say that you need to think about modes of reflection within the context of the practice as catalysts to the way in which doing thinking can happen within your work. So you could be tempted when you're engaged in a project, particularly when you have external deadlines or other things where you need to get a piece of work done by a particular point, to plow through its doing. And that really doesn't serve the creative practitioner researcher, the creative artist researcher, because the moments and the points of reflection do need to be built into the process, and they enable you to do the writing or note-taking or whatever other mode of reflection that you choose, which will then help you to articulate that within whatever writing that you then produce. And I think in terms of what you're reflecting on, that is obviously dependent on the type of practice that you're doing, but it's always in relationship to the inquiry or sets of questions that you are wanting to explore. And it helps you to understand what you're discovering through what is surprising, what is challenging to you, what is new that you haven't seen, how you think that aligns with current thinking and practice that you're aware of in your field. So the types of reflection can always be linked up to these kinds of feelings that you have about your work, and also the way in which you are entangling it or putting it into conversation with external ideas that you think are relevant, and certainly with relevant practices that we'll come onto, all of which forms usually part of the way in which you would write about your work. So
yeah, sorry. I think that reflexive process where the research is integrated into your practice is really clear in the book and through the commentary on the website. And I think, when you're doing work that is process driven, that is iterative,
yes,
having those moments of reflection are really important. I've just had one this Sunday. We've just done a workshop for the thing I'm working on, and I went back to the source text that's inspired all this, and it was really interesting just reading this short section and seeing how the layering of it was more detailed and more depth for me now, because of all the things we've done to get here, but how it now that's now an opportunity to now inform the next stage going forward. So that idea of reflection is really
and it's reflexive
powerful.
in that it feeds back to you and then it feeds back into the work. So there is this feedback loop, which is to do with the type of things that you're doing, the ways in which you're reflecting, how that then feeds back into the work, how that affects how you are engaging with the doing thinking. So it is reflexive. It's also reflective in the sense that it's a way of thinking. And what's interesting about what you said there, Roy, is I think it speaks to one of the things that you might want reflection to do in the context of creative practice research, which is to slightly reposition you in relation to your work, so that you have a different kind of way of looking at it that is not always from the inside of it, but that allows you to take an angle on it, to give it a perspective that maybe you haven't got within the work itself. And sometimes that can be through conversations with other people. Sometimes that can be through things that other people have written. Sometimes that can be through, engaging with other people's practice as well. But I think always that kind of positioning and repositioning of yourself helps you to see things in the work that perhaps are not evident to you when you're right in the middle of its doing. Though I think that middle of the doing is also important, just to say.
So I guess in a way it's a momentary disentanglement in order to initiate a re-entanglement.
Absolutely.
And I think different networks and connections.
For sure. And that moving in and out of the work, I think, is really valuable. You can think of it in relation to the idea of, sometimes, and it depends what work you're doing, but certainly for me, when I was doing improvisational work, you have to engage in it quite fully. And there is a requirement for the research for you to be in the work in quite an immersive way. But I always had to, find those moments to kind of pull out in studio sessions. And I think writing in studio, writing in the context of the place of your practice is a wonderful practice in and of itself. It offers a different kind of writing to when you go to somewhere else and write about. It's, I think, it's often referred to as writing from the practice as opposed to writing about. And there's place for both of those types of writing to aid reflection, different types of reflection, and depending on what it is that you are inquiring. So my inquiry was often about, in my PhD and soon afterwards, modes of improvisation and how they worked, essentially. So I had to write from the practice. There had to be something that was coming from that space, as well as repositioning myself in relation to an event that happened or a certain type of engagement, and then being able to write about it.
So I want to pick up some of this again later, but I don't want to jump ahead because it feels like the questions are sort of structured. So can you talk a little bit about how you see you refer to live intermediality in your book as a distinct mode of doing thinking, and I wondered if you could just unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah. So it does lead into, I think, what we're going to move on to, but I think it does so in a way that hopefully will make it clear how I was able to make that claim, or how I felt confident enough to make that claim. So when I engaged in my PhD, which was really about developing live intermediality and trying to understand it as a form of performance, I did a practice review. So Robin was my supervisor, Robin Nelson was my supervisor. I had no choice. I had to do a practice review. That is part of the deal. And so what I tried to do through that practice review was to position my improvised media mixing in relation to related practices. And those were things like VJing, video art, performance art, and live audio visual work. And what I found through that positioning was that I did not neatly fit into any of those disciplinary formations. And when I analysed it, what I was doing was a little, or sometimes quite a lot, different in either its intentions, its forms, its methods, or its ways of engaging with audiences. So I couldn't talk about myself as a VJ. I wasn't a video artist. I wasn't a performance artist. I wasn't a live audio visualist. I was something else. And therefore, I was starting to think, well, perhaps that is a distinctive practice. And that is different, I think, from it being good. And I think that's an interesting distinction to make. I don't think I would ever claim that I was making really excellent work in the context of the tools I was using. But I was making work that seemed to have different types of interests, intentions, forms, modes of engaging with audience. And I think it's interesting that a lot of people, and Robin would say this to me, the work has to be good enough, he would say, to be able to carry the inquiry. And for you to be able to pursue the research question, you have to have the skills in order to be able to do that. Whether creative practice research then leads to your work, art making, creative practice becoming better by anybody's particular kinds of measures of that, of course, that is all up for grabs, I think is an interesting and possibly moot point. But the other thing that contributes to me being able to say live intermediality is a distinct mode of praxis is that I think, well, I know I was asking different types of questions through the pieces that I was making. I didn't see anybody else within those fields particularly asking the questions that were relating and linking together notions of liveness and liveliness, event, presencing of a performer who's also a technical activator within the context of this kind of work. So when I put the two together, in terms of discourse around that field and what people were talking about and what I was thinking about, and then the mode of practice itself, and in the context of the practice review, that's, I think, how I was then able or felt able to claim that it was this new mode of doing thinking or intermedial praxis. So that's, I think, how that comes together.
That's very helpful, and it takes us straight into the question about Robin Nelson's book. Can you remind me the title of the book? Do you recall? I've forgotten.
Practices research. He's got two, you see. So I think the first one is like, oh God, principles, pedagogy.
Let's not embarrass ourselves. I'll find it and put it in.
Sorry, Robin.
But it's definitely a book that seems to be quite a major inspiration on your particular approach.
Oh, of course. Yeah. I mean, Robin was my supervisor along with experienced Brian, who was also a wonderful supervisor in terms of the kinds of performance embodied elements of this. But what was really helpful to me was that I found Robin's framework in the context of, as what you described, some quite dense theoretical accounts of what creative practice research is. I found it very accessible and applicable. I found that I was able to take the things that Robin proposed and to apply and to adapt them to my project.
Great. And neither of us get any kickback from selling Robin's book. So
don't get a thing.
So one of the things that was really interesting, that I found really interesting, was this idea of a practice review.
Yeah.
And it really sat very well for me in across the bridge from the academic to the practice, because it's like, well, how do you do that? So this practice review is used to locate the praxis in a lineage.
Yes.
Can you explain what that means to us?
Yeah, I can. I think in terms of what your lineage is as a practitioner, that is really your choice to make. You have to decide what you think are the practices that are come before you or that are currently happening that are relevant or similar or, linked to what it is that you're doing, either in terms of what they're looking at, their methods, their ways in which they engage and disseminate, whatever that might be. So to some extent, I would say that has to be up to the practitioner researcher themselves to define what their lineage is. Now, of course, you could run the risk of somebody saying, well, why haven't you looked at so-and-so? Because that's obviously the same way that somebody can say to you, why haven't you read that book? That one you should have read, those kind of questions that might come up at a PhD Viva or other kind of assessment of your work. And I think all that I would say in relation to that is, yes, do the same way that you would do a kind of rigorous review of what is relevant literature. You do as much as you feel able to a rigorous review of what the practice is that you think feeds into your work, but only you can decide what that is really as you as the practitioner. But what I would say is that a practice review is absolutely key to understanding the distinctiveness of creative practice as a research endeavour. And I cannot recommend it enough to people who are practitioner researchers as a way of you understanding your work better and what contributions you think you can make to a field of creative practice within which you identify as sitting. So the things I did, I went to see live performances, I took notes, I reviewed online materials, I identified commonalities, intention, content, methods, modes of performance, but also, of course, looked for the differences, where my work differed and departed and why that might have been. And sometimes it was to do with things to do with venues and funding and the amount of money that might be available, or me as a maker. And sometimes it was to do with the things that I had set out to investigate and explore. And I really did learn, a lot more about the work through those types of comparisons. And another thing that's really great about a practice review, I think, is it starts to give you the language that you might want and need to describe your work to others and to articulate what it does as a research endeavour. Now, I don't think it replaces a literature review, unfortunately. I don't think you can avoid doing some reading around your area, though I think we can talk a little bit about the idea of how much reading am I expected to do to position my work. But in terms of the reading and the literature, that's being part of the conversation that surrounds your work. So there will be discourse around the type of practice that you are making, and you want to be part of that. You have to engage with the ideas that are circulating so that you can understand how the things that you're doing might contribute to that debate. But it is also an essential part of a creative practice research endeavour, I think, to know your fields of practice as well and to articulate where you sit, whether that's within or between fields. And I think language is a really interesting part of that, because it starts to give you the language or allow you to say it's not that type of practice. I can't describe myself in that way. So I need slightly different language, or I need to adapt what I'm doing. But it helps that articulation, I think, of what is distinctive about what you're doing.
I thought it was really clear in your book, but in a way, because you were trying to position yourself in yourself, as you just said, you were not that, not that, not that. You were something kind of in between. It really helps see that. But I think in a way, we all of our practice is kind of unique, and so that we all have that. I might be a documentary filmmaker, but I have my own approach. But I can still situate that within a lineage of different practices and so on. So I think that is really, really helpful, and I hadn't really kind of seen it formulated like that so clearly before, and it was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. I thought, wow, and I wrote it
down. Oh wow, praise indeed.
So so here's a question for you that I'm kind of intrigued by, because there is a sense that some creative practice research is can I say willfully, evidentially experimental, and the case that I'm going to put on the table is, say, just hypothetically, 1970s scratch video, and there is and Nick may well be in the conversation here somewhere, but he did his prior publication by practice, and his practice was in the 1970s as a scratch video artist. Now, that as a practice, it kind of wears its experimentality on its sleeve, and you can kind of easily sit there and go, oh, I can see the experimental practice there. But I can think of other examples where that evidentiality is not apparent in the practice, and I could probably argue for reasons why that might be the case. So, for example, I might be putting on an opera in a local venue, and I want the audience to come and enjoy it, and maybe I don't want them to be sat there going, oh, that's very experimental. Maybe I want to do, maybe the experiment is not necessarily present in the presentation to the audience, is what I'm saying. So what would you say? How would you go about evidencing the experimental practice within your work if it's not evidentially on the screen or on the stage? And maybe that's a challenging question, because I think you would probably acknowledge that your practice is, you see videos of it, and it is evidentially, you're improvising, you're playing with ideas and experimenting.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm going to deal with that question in a couple of ways. The first thing to say is that, I mean, absolutely, your example of 70s scratch video is a form that is in and of itself trying something out and experimenting. It is experimental in its nature. And I think a lot of art making is doing thinking, even if it doesn't sit in the academy, even if it isn't talking about itself as research. There is no doubt about that. Often, these days artists are attached to universities, as we'll come on to talk about them. Not all of them have PhDs, not all of them feel like they need them, but it doesn't stop, for all intents and purposes, their work being, for me, a mode of doing thinking. That is exactly what it is doing. So I think doing thinking happens a lot within the art world, within and out with the academy, and that's whether the academy acknowledges it or not. I think it's a different question as to how you fit your work, experimental, evidently experimental or not, within the frameworks of the academy, which we can talk about. Now, if I have, not all creative practice is research, it just isn't. Some creative practices you've described is made for purposes which are not about trying to find out or inquire or explore. So, I mean, if we go to that, very clear, very simple definition of research that, for instance, UKRI have, then what we're looking at is something that is a process of investigation leading to new insights effectively shared. I think that's probably mangled that, but it's pretty much that. And in the sense of that, the there is a simplicity in some ways to how you then might evidence those things. So my experimentation might not at all be evident in the output that is the creative output that an audience might see. You might not be able to see within that where my inquiring has happened, where my exploring has happened, and where my finding out is. Perhaps that just really marks an end point of the process through which I have investigated, explored, and found out. And I often talk to, researchers, doctoral researchers, postdoctoral researchers about where they position their inquiry within their work. Because sometimes the inquiry really sits within the process and within certain types of methods that are not open to the public or revealed through a creative output at the end. And in that case, then you do have to think carefully about, you do have to think carefully if you want to present this work as research within the academy, about how you can provide somebody who wasn't within that space evidence of your inquiring, your finding out, and the kind of things that you have discovered through that process. Now, clearly, as I think we'll come on to talk about, one of the ways in which you do that is through a mode of documenting the process of creation, and then a way, I think, of like annotating and revealing those documents to somebody such that they would understand, number one, what you were trying to do, number two, how you went about doing it, number three, what you found out. So the idea of effectively shared, so process of investigation, okay, yeah, I'm trying to find something out. Leading to new insights, I need to prove that through positioning it within the context of relevant theory and practice. So I can say, there isn't anybody who's really had that particular thought, insight, way of doing that I have. This is how I know that. And then effectively shared might not be the creative output at the end of the process. It might be a way of revealing the process to somebody so that they can understand that investigative process, the methods that you have used, and what exactly it is that you've found out. And of course, there's any number of ways in which you might document. And I always say, fit your documentation to your inquiry. Always look at the way in which you are finding, as much as you can, the line of the inquiry within the many things that you might be doing as part of your creative process, and then trying as much as you can to trace that through the process. And that tracing can be through reflection, of course, but it can also be through modes of documentation that you choose.
I think that's really helpful and really clear, because it feels to me that we don't, while I would encourage people to take your approach and document and reflect as you go, it's not always the case that is part of the practice of making.
Yeah.
But I would argue that it's often the case that there's still an experimental inquiry going on, but it's not necessarily generating evidence in such an overt way, perhaps.
Yeah.
And that can be a challenge, especially if and we're going to talk about this as in a second. So in my questions here, this is about the documentation. Really, if you haven't documented as you go, how do you start? You've done this thing, and now you're being said, right, okay, well, you need to find that mode of documentation and that way of revealing the process. How are you going to proceed? What's our first step? Okay,
so I think this is particularly, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the context of, for instance, PhDs by publication, where there is a body of practice that somebody has undertaken, and then they are presenting that body of practice as, commensurate with a PhD in terms of its rigor, its pursuit of a particular inquiry, and its insights and findings. I'll say first that I'm actually really a little bit in love with documentation. I'm somebody who's really in danger of fetishizing the document, as I think often is said in documentation studies, particularly in performance. So I really love thinking about how I can most effectively convey a research process, how different intersections of things can work to reveal something. So that might be media, notes, reflections. And my latest project, I think, is kind of documenting itself beautifully, because one of my creative methods is regular field notes and reflective field notes. So those field notes trace the path of a particular kind of experiential inquiry that I am engaging with. And I'm also doing a lot of field recording, which effectively in itself documents a certain type of experience in the field. Moving on to your question more specifically, I think it is very difficult to ask somebody to document something which has already happened and to find a way of pulling themselves back into a moment which has already happened and a creative process that's already passed. So if you are somebody who is trying to do that, they're trying to look back at a body of work and think about how that body of work constitutes a coherent research inquiry, I don't think documentation is the key to that. I think what you need to do is to look at what you have, clearly. And the kind of process I would recommend is, number one, before you do anything, just review all the documentation of practice and any writing that you have about your work, and just start to write what are the themes, the threads, the methods that you think run through that body of work. Because one of the things, as my understanding, correct me if this is not correct in your institution, that's challenging about PhD by publication for practitioner researchers is that you have to identify, a clear, coherent thread that binds together that body of work, and that it can make it, allow you to articulate it as a single related research inquiry through these different practices. So you're looking at your own work is the first stage of that, I would say. Then I think you go to related practices if you haven't done that already, and start to look around in terms of the kinds of practices that surround what you're doing. And then I would say that a little bit of reading around any themes that you've identified and seeing what other people are saying about those particular areas, either areas of practice or areas of theory, and then to try and think about how the work that you've done through that, set of whatever it is that you've made might intervene in any of those debates. And then what I would do is I would go back to the documentation such as you have, or any notes or reflections that you have, and then try and identify within the work that you've done how those particular kinds of ideas, themes, threads, methods are emerging. And then you can start to characterize what you've discovered through those sets of creative processes, or the ways in which the work is thinking through something. And I think it's useful to think about, this is another Robin Nelson from his more recent book, notion that he talks about practice as research, and some people say practice research. Don't worry, I don't think about the nomenclature too much. But he said most recently, and I liked this, that the function of the as in PAR is to indicate that the consideration of practice as research requires, and he says this, attending differently to the practice. So I've done this body of work. I've done it really as a creative practitioner. How can I, in retrospect, attend to it differently, such that I will find out things about it that might help me to articulate what it has found out as a research endeavor? And I think that's very different to what some people would critically call retrofitting your creative practice. Mm-hmm. That is trying to say that it was looking at something which it wasn't, or trying to bolt on a theory to it so that it feels like it's got some weight to it. It's different to go back and to identify things that perhaps weren't necessarily totally evident to you within the making of the work, but which certainly in retrospect you can see would constitute a way of finding out and some discovery. So that's what I would say in relation to that. Really, and I acknowledge, really difficult thing to do, which is often asked of practitioners coming into the academy.
That is really very, very useful, actually, and I think it's a sort of almost a playbook of how to do this. But I absolutely see it happening. People coming at this and going, oh, well, I've done all this work and I've got all this stuff, but now I need to articulate it. And I think that there is a significant challenge there for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very, 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 very different. So I'm aware of the time, and so I think I'm going to sort of move a little through these questions and say, how would you advise other creative practice researchers to approach moments of perceived failure in their projects, and how might they transform these blind alleys or dead ends into productive perspectives to fuel future inquiry and methodological revision? How can you use failure as a positive?
Yeah.
There's a section in your book on it, and I was really intrigued by that.
Well, absolutely. And as the book charts, and certainly many times since that book was written, my practice, in all intents and purposes, in terms of what I might have set out to do, has failed. It has failed in what I wanted to achieve. And that doesn't feel good. And I acknowledge that really strongly, that often the feeling that comes with a perceived failure on your part, particularly of creative practice, which often is really bound up in yourself. We're very attached to our work. We feel very embedded in it. It feels very reflective of us as well. But failure is at the heart of where research happens in creative practice, because the reflection upon it and subsequent learning that can arise from a moment where things just don't work the way you imagined leads you to places and possibilities which simply cannot emerge if you did everything, it worked exactly as you hoped it would, and you made the piece that you envisioned that you would by the end of it. And that could be a very effective creative process, but it's not really a research process, because you're not really finding out anything you didn't know at the beginning of that process. So my advice is, don't deny the emotional response that you have to such a moment. And I think if you're able to, and if you feel like you want to, you can try and document that moment of what it feels like for the work not to work, because that might be relevant to your inquiry, depending on what you're looking at. But equally, it's useful to let it sit for a while, whatever that moment is, whether it's within a studio, just you, whether it's shared with an audience or people who are viewing your work, giving yourself a bit of space from it, and then returning to review and reflect on it. And this is where that angling of yourself in relation to the moment that you have experienced of perceived failure is really valuable. So positioning yourself slightly differently. My experience, Brian, who was my other supervisor, always used to say, like, you can look at your own failures as somebody who's quite interested in what happened, rather than somebody who's directly affected by what happened. So try and cultivate this idea. And I suppose that is a mode of distancing. It's trying to kind of find a little bit of space between you and your initial gut response to the work. But if you can look at it with that interest, if you can position yourself or leverage yourself, either through conversation, like we talked about, through engaging with a theoretical perspective of what you have done, through methods, things like thin description, which is quite interesting, thick description, the Clifford Hertz thing, which is all about quite, embodied and engaged description of things, which takes into account interpretation and feeling. But thin description is the opposite, where you try to just note the facts of what happened and use that as a way to kind of just come around yourself a little bit and to avoid some of those feelings. And then really through that leveraging of yourself into a different position in relation to this moment of perceived failure, I think you can think about where that leads you. So where does it go? So where is the route out of that moment in the context of the inquiry you set out? And this is important. So not thinking about the route out in the context of the lens of the piece of the work that you wanted to make or the creative practice that you want to do, but in the inquiry that you set yourself, the thing that you wanted to find out. Because actually, in the end, freeing yourself from an imagined endpoint of a project or the thing that you thought that you really wanted to make, really engaging in the now of finding out in that moment of failure is the heart of the matter, is the real heart of the research. And that's the place where the exciting and interesting new things happen. If you can reposition yourself to see that moment in that way, then you will find routes out of it that will be valuable to you and valuable to the research. Even if in the context of the work that you're making, art work that you're making, creative work that we're making, that is something that, you know, you would still say is a failure on some technical or aesthetic terms. Tim Mengold's got a lovely quote about this, where he says, what appears to us in the first instance as stoppages turn out when we search again, and he says that is in our research, to be openings that let us in. And that whole idea that just being able to see the research in that moment might allow you into it in a way which means that you can understand it as a really exciting moment of possibility in your work.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, I think the short answer to that is embrace failure.
You have to, because really, if you're genuinely doing research for your creative practice, you're gonna fail all the time.
Yeah. I like to say to students that if it wasn't for the fact that we embrace failure as a method of learning, we'd all still be crawling.
Oh, absolutely. No, I agree. So yes, it goes beyond any kind of research, doesn't it? It's like a life thing, isn't it?
Joanne, I'm going to wrap up, although it's very tempting just to keep going. I'm mindful of the time, and I do want to pass over to questions. So I'm going to say thank you very much for your time today. I feel that we've actually really unpacked quite a lot of the questions I had. Hopefully we've done so for other people. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording now, and I'm going to pass over to questions. Although I might leave it recording because I don't want to upset the AI summarizing as it goes. It might stop if I do that.
Don't upset the AI, please.
No. So if anyone's got any questions, do you want to tap them into the chat, and I will pass them on to Joanne for you? Or any questions or any comments? There's one question from Christina Caulfield saying,
yeah, it would be great if Christina's willing to talk about that. So I think
you want to turn on your mic?
Posing something, Christine, there that I would be interested to hear about.
So Christina says,
thanks Joe, and thanks Roy.
Go for it.
I was just I kind of put this note in here a little while ago when you were talking, Joe, just about like having to do kind of reading, which I think you were alluding to in terms of like academic texts. But it just made me really think, as someone who's like teaching a group of like first year PhD students, about like what in my program is termed research creation. And I often kind of try to frame it as in, you know, this concept of like, what type of reading do you have to do to kind of prepare yourself to, you know, define and embark on a project. And I often try to get them to think about reading in a very expanded way, because it need not be kind of so confined. And I kind of think like that type of expansive application of like approaching these like key terms like reading or research, right, it is kind of a good way to try and nurture like the type of expansive thinking that I think this type of work really requires. So it's really kind of a comment rather than a question, but if you do have any thoughts, that would be great to hear. Thank you.
I just think it's great to hear that, Christina, and I'm really interested that your program is called research creation, because that's the Canadian term. They use that a lot in Canada, as opposed to practices research or practice research. But obviously, I think we're in the same kind of area, aren't we? It's all pretty much the same kind of endeavor. Yeah, I really welcome that comment, because I think that often we feel that reading in the context of research has to be very dense, philosophical, academic texts. Often it's the idea that this weighty theory can add some validity to our fleeting, ephemeral, creative activities. And I think we have to get past that, and we have to understand that is not the way in which it works. And for me, the kind of reading that is helpful within a creative practice research project is usually, and by its nature, interdisciplinary. It asks you to read in lots of different kinds of ways, different types of texts, different types heading into different disciplines, which is always interesting and challenging. I mean, I'm reading lots of geographical social science stuff at the moment, which I find very, very difficult. And I find it difficult on lots of levels because of some of the ways in which that research is formulated, some of the assumptions which underpin some of the ways in which that research is formulated, and then how I link it to the kinds of things that I'm interested in. But certainly, the types of reading that might inform a creative practice are wide and diverse, and should be. And we don't have to be constrained by any kind of, for goodness sake, kind of Enlightenment thinking, Western canon of certain types of philosophers, dead Frenchmen usually, that have to be linked to a project. That is absolutely not where we are. And I actually think that creative practitioner researchers are the best people for opening up different types of knowledges, different types of knowings that sit outside and beyond what has traditionally been thought of as knowledge within university settings, which we know, is colonial and white supremacist and all of those things, and needs updating desperately, and needs our inputs to do that, because privileging embodied forms of knowledge and privileging other ways of knowing that sit outside that is extremely valuable. So anyway, that's one thing that I really value about what you've said there, Christina. I also think it's worth thinking about, as a practitioner researcher, your expertise sits within your practice as research. So it sits within the creative practice. That is where you are the person who knows what is going on and can claim expertise. The things that sit around that, which might be theories and ideas about the work, or indeed what I call resonant ideas, which can be certain types of thinking or thought or politics or ideologies or whatever it is that you are linking into your work for various different reasons, I think does and can be quite diverse, quite various, and not necessarily something that you need to therefore be an expert in. I think this can often constrain creative practitioner researchers from engaging in that wide reading that you've described, Christina, which is that, oh, well, I have to know that inside out. I have to know that particular area of knowledge, because otherwise somebody's going to come back at me and say, oh, you didn't read that book by that person and you don't know this thing. That's not what creative practice researchers need to do, in my opinion. You center your expertise in your practice, and then you choose and engage with theories which obviously are relevant to your work, that link to what it's trying to do. So you are engaged in the discourse around it, resonant in terms of the things that really resonate ideas-wise with what you're trying to do, whatever it might be, your inquiry. But how you bring those ideas to bear within the practice and within the research inquiry is where your kind of expertise lies, rather than a very, very kind of detailed knowledge of, particular theories and areas and bodies of knowledge. Sometimes that is appropriate for a creative practice research project. Other times it will be interdisciplinary and various, and you cannot be an expert in all those areas, and nor should you think that you have to be. You need to know how that theory links into, is active and present within the context of your inquiry, and you need to be able to articulate that. But I don't think that necessarily means that you have to therefore engage in, the kind of reading of however many books in order to justify using a quote from a theorist, let's say. So that's
just a super quick follow-up. I don't want to kind of take up too much time, but just to kind of qualify what I'm saying too is that beyond like interdisciplinarity, I think there's also a kind of real value to really think in like paradigm shifting ways about like what constitutes reading, like even to the point of, well, what do we use to read? Like just our eyes and our brain, or how else might we actually read? Can like watching a film or seeing an art installation, like what other senses are we using to read this specific experience, and how does that inform the way that I'm making? And even like, can we think of drawing as reading, just using a different set of faculties? So I think there are these all very kind of rich and abundant different directions that we can move in when we start to rethink these very specific like labels, such as like reading, making, showing, that type of thing. So
Great.
thanks.
Thank you very much, Christina. Sammy has a question. She'd like to hear more about improvisation and practice and how one can describe the improvisational process in a way that's academically legible. And actually, I'd direct you to read Jo's book, because I think that's exactly what you do, isn't it, really?
Yeah, well, I try to do it. Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard, Sammy, as you recognize in your question that you come up against this quite frequently, but you value improvisation in your work. So obviously improvisation is not replicable and repeatable and all of those things that a scientific research, inquiry would have to be, but that's not what you're doing. So remember that. You don't need to be doing research that is repeatable by somebody else. That's not where we're at. And when we try and apply those kinds of methods to our discipline, doesn't work, all right? It really, really doesn't. In terms of how I've tried to make improvisation academically legible, obviously, coming back to Christina's question, I've done quite a lot of reading, and my reading very definitely included watching other people improvise, engaging with improvised events in lots of different kinds of ways, and noting and reflecting upon what I was experiencing as an audience member, and then pulling that into my own work through then doing the same kinds of notes and reflections from the inside of the improvisation. But I am a little bit of a, I do make lots of lists, and I'm kind of quite, I could lay things out, and that helped me in terms of pulling apart a little bit what was the nature of the improvisation that I was doing, because improvisation is a very broad term, and it covers a range of different practices, and it covers a range of different approaches, which can be from something that's quite structured but has a bit of freedom into it to something which really is just made up as it goes along. So I started to think a little bit about the kind of functions and prompts that were leading my improvisation. So I played with different kinds of prompts, and then I reflected and noted what happened when I worked with different kinds of prompts. So these might be prompts that are words, but they might be prompts that are sounds or images. And then I also started to try and think a little bit through this idea of improvisation in relation, because my improvisation was always in relation to technologies, how improvisation was not something that I was doing, but that was being done to me, and that was a kind of affective feedback loop between me, the affordances of the technology, my ability to be able to manipulate certain types of machines, and then the outcomes in the form of a mix of sound and image in my case. So that, I suppose, quite granular, detailed investigation of practice through looking at methods, through looking at felt states within the context of improvisation. And then also, of course, I did also ask my audience in various different ways how they responded to the types of modes of improvisation that I was engaging with. So what we think about there, I think, is this kind of idea of a multi-mode inquiry where you're cross-referencing different forms of evidence and different forms of articulation to support you being able to say something about your work that you have found out through the doing of it, that you felt in the doing of it, but that you might want to, position in a more kind of academic way. So all of those things support being able to take something which is very loose and felt and ephemeral, and then placing it in a context which might mean that somebody else could read about and understand it, and understand what you were trying to do with that mode of improvisation through what you've written and the documentation as well. I also did a few things with, and these are on the website that Roy referenced, where I did these improvised video texts around different types of themes and ideas. That was a way of testing out and exploring how improvisation could speak to some of the threads of my inquiry directly. So not writing about it necessarily, but improvising about these ideas too. So that was another way, I think.
I think there is lots of, I've seen some great examples of people articulating their research not in writing through different ways of doing it. I went to a conference once and the keynote presented the keynote as show tunes and just sang the show tunes. He'd rewritten the words, but I thought it was really good. I'm going to just close on one last comment. Louise, do you want to speak your comment or shall I read it?
No, I can speak it. Why not? So I'm a bit of a noob with this researching malarkey. I found it quite difficult to kind of get my head round. And it was really nice hearing you speak about reading, because I feel that's all I've done, basically. Yes, it was really nice to hear that, when you're doing reading, I've already written 2 papers because but it's because I'm reading, literature reviews and reading around other subjects and things like that and trying to find, but it really has upped my knowledge and confidence in what I'm researching. And it's just really nice to hear that I'm perhaps on the right path to being some sort of researcher, because it's quite easy to doubt whether you're doing it right or not. So thank you for your words. It's been really inspiring.
Oh, not at all. And it doesn't sound like you're on the path to being a researcher. It sounds like you are a researcher.
Huzzah.
So, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point that, and it's not, academia is the home of imposter syndrome. I understand that more generally, but I think it's particularly challenging in the context of creative practice research, which, even though, as Roy said, it's very much accepted in the academy, and we know that it's a perfectly valid way of researching, it still feels often like you are justifying, what you are doing, particularly to anybody who sits outside your field, and if you are in conversation with people within your institution about your work. So just try and hold on to that confidence that you've gained, because I think it's often hard won when we get that kind of confidence, but it sounds like you really have worked to get that, and it sounds like what you're doing now is understanding and being confident in your own work as research, which is a brilliant place to be. And I really hope that bears more fruit for you as well in terms of future practice. Yeah,
exactly. And it's also having the confidence to speak about it as well, which is something else that's quite difficult. I've had a couple of talks and oh God, I nearly fainted. But thank you.
No, I think that's right. And I think the articulation is always really, really challenging, because there is such a complexity to creative practice research, which sits, because we were talking about entanglements, we're talking about entanglements of ideas and practices, but also in and of itself, a creative process is complex. There's a lot of things going on. So the ways of articulating are often really, really, challenging. And I think it's lovely to think about, thinking about your show tunes, ways which help you to articulate what you're doing without tying you up in knots. And that can be all sorts of things. I had a researcher that I was working with who just did not want to present their work really in this kind of, oral way. So they just made these beautiful kind of video texts that did all the talking, and that was how they presented their research often. And it had all the ideas in it, but it also had the methods that they were using as a filmmaker and a video artist, a filmmaker primarily, and a songmaker actually. And all of those things wove together in the context of that presentation to articulate what they were doing and what they were finding out. And that was it. You find the ways that best serve your practice, but which help you as well to articulate what you're doing, particularly in the context of like more formal presentations. And more formal presentations, they really need some more creative input, the academic paper, those kind of things that can be perfectly valid and interesting, but it's lovely. It's always valuable when somebody is able to find you know, a more interesting, creative way of articulating and sharing what they're doing. So I'm so behind the show tunes keynote. That sounds wonderful.
Well, in a way, that the challenge is for moving away from academic texts is that the journals don't have any multimedia capability. Is the real restriction there? Although there are some journals, and certainly I'm involved with the International Journal of Creative Media Research up there, that's just rebranding and relaunching itself, and the whole aim there is to be able to accept papers that are non-traditional. And in fact, a couple of years ago, I was doing a special issue with Journal of Media Practice and Education, and we managed to get in a graphic novel as a paper. And so it is possible. It's just it takes a little bit of pushing to get through. So
yeah,
sorry.
That they are starting to grow. There are a few more now. So there's a new journal that's just launched out of Lithuania that I'm peer reviewing for, called Landing. That's a creative practice research journal. Hub, which is here in Portugal, comes out of the University of Porto. That's also a space where you can submit creative practice in a range of different forms using the research catalogue, which if you don't know about it, then please do go and find out, because that's a wonderful space for if you want to just publish a project outside of the remit of a journal. You can do that through the research catalogue, and you can arrange your text, your media, your sound, whatever it is that you want to use in whatever way you want on the page, and create a whole kind of what they call exposition, which gives a reader or somebody an insight into your work. But and then Journal of Artistic Research is quite well established, and the Journal of Embodied Research is another one. So all of those, Journal of Embodied Research is video essays. So that's specifically for articulating your research in the form of a video essay. But the others can be mixed, multimedia, mixed kind of mode presentations.
Vera has asked if you can share a link to the research catalogue.
Yeah.
I don't have a link to that. Thank you. I'm going to draw it to a close now. Much as we could go on and on and break out a few glasses of wine, and we could still be here in a couple of hours' time, I'm sure. But thank you to Jo for spending the time with us. Thank you to the audience for being here and making it something worthwhile. We will be putting this up on YouTube at some point in time. I just need to find the time to do the editing now. I need an army I need a creative business of young people to be taking this away and now repurposing it and turning it into content. Although we don't really want to be content, do we? So
this is a problem. As soon as you go on YouTube, you're content. That's it. Done.
So thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording now and see you next time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Roy. Thank you, everybody. It's lovely to see you.
Sorry, I forgot to say, you need to like, share and comment.